Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into something significant, a story that definitely jumped out at us. We're talking about a sudden, pretty major shift in the trade relationship between the U.S. and India, two global players. Now, you might be thinking, okay, another trade spat. We hear about these. But this one feels different, doesn't it? A partnership that seemed to be strengthening, especially, as a counterbalance in the Indo-Pacific, suddenly hits this huge roadblock. We're focusing on August 1st, 2025, a date that sent, well, immediate shockwaves through both economies and their strategic link. So our mission today is simple. Break down what actually happened, why these two powerhouses ended up here at this impasse, and, importantly, what it might signal for the future. We've gone through the research, the analysis, the official lines to give you the clearest view of this complex dance. Diplomacy versus dollars, basically. Okay, let's zero in on that date then. August 1st, 2025. What was the big news? The bombshell that dropped?
It's fascinating, actually. The suddenness and the way it was delivered, very direct. On that day, President Trump announced it via Truth Social, a 25% tariff on all goods coming in from India. The message was blunt, something like, India's tariffs are among the world's highest, unfair to our farmers, our manufacturers. And then the kicker. Starting today, 25% tariff on everything until they open their markets. Boom.
Wow. Just like that.
Just like that. But there was another layer, too, almost immediately. The announcement also hinted, kind of vaguely, at some other penalty linked to India's dealings with Russia. Energy, defense ties.
So not just trade then. Geopolitics makes right in from the start.
Exactly. It added this whole other dimension right away, made it much more complex than just tariffs.
Okay, a 25% blanket tariff is
Yeah.
a big move. But like you said, these things don't usually happen in a vacuum. What were the deeper roots, the tensions already simmering?
Oh, absolutely not out of the blue. You're right. While the announcement felt sudden, the underlying issues were brewing for years. What we found is that the U.S. and India, the world's two biggest democracies, they've been in trade talks for ages, trying to strengthen ties. And they had made progress. Trade hit, about $132 billion in the last fiscal year. India actually had a pretty hefty surplus, over $41 billion.
Okay, so numbers are going up, but
Yeah. Beneath the surface, there was this persistent sticking point. Agriculture, specifically dairy, corn, and soybeans. The U.S. is a massive exporter, right? And they've been pushing India hard for more access, arguing that India's tariffs, and they vary wildly, some 7%, some nearly 70%, were just way too high, an unfair barrier.
right. So you've got the U.S. side, these big, often subsidized agribusinesses, especially thinking about states like Iowa, Illinois, wanting to sell more. Makes sense from their perspective.
Right.
But what's India's side? Why hold the line so firmly on agriculture? Why those high tariffs?
India's perspective is, it's grounded entirely in their domestic situation. It's crucial to understand this. Their agricultural sector employs millions upon millions. It's absolutely vital for food security in the country. So the big fear in New Delhi is that if they just open the floodgates to, heavily subsidized American imports, it could completely wipe out their own farmers. We're talking about a huge number of small-scale, often unorganized farms. Many are basically subsistence farmers.
Living off what they grow.
Exactly. So this isn't just economics for them. It's deeply political, highly sensitive. And we saw proof of that, didn't we? Those massive farmer protests back in 2020 and again in 2024, they were so significant they actually forced the government to pull back on farm laws they'd already passed.
Right, that context is key. It shows just how powerful that constituency is.
Absolutely. It explains why protecting agriculture is seen almost as a non-negotiable. Plus, you add in the U.S. perspective again, this ongoing trade deficit with India. It was around $45.7 billion in 2024, up over 5% from the year before. So that adds fuel to the U.S. frustration, too. It's a real tension.
Definitely sounds like a powder keg. So with these really strong opposing interests, how did the negotiations actually go down in 2024 when they were trying to bridge this gap?
Well, the talks definitely picked up pace in 2024. The U.S. put a clear offer on the table, basically. India, you lowered your tariffs on our dairy, corn, soybeans. In return, we'll cut U.S. tariffs on some of your stuff, like textiles, jewelry, a classic trade-off attempt.
A quid pro quo.
Right. But India based on everything we've seen, just drew a hard line when it came to agriculture, a red line, effectively. Prime Minister Modi's government just wouldn't budge on things that directly hit farmers' pockets. Their Commerce Minister, Piyush Goyal, even said something like, India is always very sensitive to farmer interests, and they'll make sure those concerns are well protected.
It sounds pretty final. Not much wiggle room there.
It signals the immense domestic pressure they were under. It wasn't just a negotiating tactic.
So what were the specific points where they just hit a wall? The things they absolutely couldn't agree on that led to the deadlock?
We identified a few key roadblocks. First, dairy and GM foods genetically modified. That was a big one. India really resisted U.S. demands for market access, not just for GM crops, but even for cattle feed derived from certain sources.
Why the resistance there?
It seems to be a mix. Partly religious sensitivities, for example, not wanting imports from animals fed with animal-derived feed, but also just broader health concerns about GM products.
Okay.
What else? Then there was corn and soybeans. India was genuinely worried about what they called predatory pricing. The fear was that huge global agribusiness companies could just dump cheap products onto the Indian market, crush local prices, and basically ruin millions of small farmers economically.
A real fear of being overwhelmed by scale and subsidies.
Precisely. And finally, it did a bit tit for tat on trade barriers generally. The U.S. pointed fingers at India's food safety rules, their inspection processes, agricultural subsidies, calling them unfair non-tariff barriers. But India fired back saying, hang on, the U.S. has its own sky-high tariffs too, pointing to things like, I think it was 350% on some tobacco. Huge numbers.
350%. Wow.
Yeah. So despite rounds and rounds of talks, they were even planning a sixth round for late August 2025. Nothing gave. The frustration on the U.S. side clearly mounted, leading up to President Trump's public comments about India's dead economy and, again, those links to Russia.
And then, bang, August 1st, the tariff hits.
Mm-hmm.
So who feels that 25% punch first? Which Indian exports are most exposed?
It's a really broad sweep. The tariff hits major categories: textiles, jewelry, certainly pharmaceuticals, electronics, even things like auto components. To put some numbers on it, India's total exports to the U.S. were, $87 billion in 2024. Pharma alone was over $8 billion. Telecom gear, $6.5 billion. Gems and jewelry, that's a massive one, over $10 billion exported to the U.S.
$10 billion just in gems and jewelry.
Yeah, or about ours, 83,000 crores. So slapping a 25% tariff on top of that, it's going to seriously inflate costs. You're looking at shipment delays, pricing chaos, industries like gems and jewelry where margins can be thin, they're going to be scrambling. It disrupts everything.
And it's never just one way, is it? What about the blowback on the U.S. side? How do American consumers, American businesses feel this?
It really is the definition of a lose-lose, unfortunately. For U.S. consumers, the most direct hit is probably higher prices. For all sorts of goods imported from India, clothes, maybe some medicines, other consumer products, it just costs more at the checkout.
Right. Inflation pressure.
Exactly. And for American businesses, especially retailers or manufacturers who rely on Indian components or finished goods, big problems. Supply chains get disrupted, production costs might go up, delays happen, and eventually those costs often get passed along anyway.
So everyone feels the pinch somehow.
Pretty much. The economists we looked at were pretty clear. American consumers pay more, Indian exporters suffer. But there's maybe a longer-term insight, too. This kind of shock forces businesses everywhere to rethink their supply chains, maybe diversify away from India, which ironically might weaken the very ties the U.S. wanted to build.
That's a really interesting point. The unintended consequences. Which brings us beyond just the economics. This clearly has ripple effects for the bigger picture, the strategic relationship between the U.S. and India. Well, what are the stakes there?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe the billion-dollar question. What's really at risk here? This tariff could put serious strain on that strategic partnership. An alliance that's been growing is seen as really important, especially as a counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, that's been the narrative for years.
Right. So all the recent cooperation defense deals, tech sharing, quad meetings that could all be undermined by this trade fight. Analysts are debating this right now. Is this just a hardball tactic to force concessions from India? Or does it risk genuinely pushing away a key ally, especially at a time when, the global situation feels pretty unstable? There's a worry this could create an opening, a vacuum that maybe China steps into.
A high-stakes gamble then, potentially. So, given all that, where do things go now? Is there a way out, or are we just digging in for a long trade fight?
The path forward is definitely murky, uncertain. But there are some signs, maybe glimmers of hope. Both sides have said Publicly, at least, they're willing to keep talking. That U.S. delegation is still apparently scheduled to arrive in India around August 25th for that sixth round.
So the door isn't completely shut. What could a resolution look like?
Well, a few possibilities. Maybe India offers concessions, but not on agriculture. Perhaps they lower tariffs on American machinery or technology, things less sensitive back home.
Okay, shift the focus.
Or maybe some kind of phased reduction on farm tariffs over time, or a quota system letting in a certain amount but not unlimited. But those face huge political hurdles in India, given, as we discussed, the farmer situation. Very difficult.
Right, and from the U.S. side?
The U.S. could potentially lift the tariff, but likely only if India agrees to concrete steps, like guaranteeing increased purchases of U.S. farm goods or really tackling those non-tariff barriers the U.S. complained about. It's going to require some very tricky diplomacy, a real balancing act with domestic politics looming large on both sides.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly complex. You've got the hardcore political reality of agriculture in India, and you've got, let's be frank, domestic political calculations driving decisions in the U.S. too. It's not just pure economics or policy.
Absolutely. And stepping back again, just for that bigger picture perspective, it's interesting to note the asymmetry we found in tariff policies generally. We talked about India's high farm tariffs, 7% to 68%. But the U.S. itself, well, it has some monsters too. We found maximum U.S. tariffs hitting 350% on some tobacco, over 200% on certain dairy items, 130% on some fruits and vegetables if quotas are filled.
So it's not like one side is pure free trade and the other is protectionist.
Not at all. It shows both countries use tariffs strategically to protect domestic interests when they feel they need to. They just prioritize different sectors. It really highlights how complex and sometimes hypocritical global trade can be.
This whole situation, this deep dive into the U.S.-India tariff fight, it really does lay bare just how complicated these international negotiations are. You can see the legitimate concerns on both sides. India trying to protect millions of vulnerable farmers, the U.S. pushing for what it sees as fair market access for its own powerful industries. Finding that balance, that sweet spot, it's incredibly difficult, but also so crucial for keeping that vital relationship on track.
Absolutely. And this tariff, the one that kicked in August 1st, 2025, it's a major test, a real test of diplomacy. It could have long-lasting effects, not just on their bilateral trade, but potentially on global supply patterns, geopolitics, and consumers, businesses, they're feeling it now. A very real reminder of how linked we all are.
So what does this all mean for you listening? I think it's a really powerful example that trade disputes aren't just abstract economic debates. They're deeply about people, about livelihoods, security, and that incredibly delicate, complex dance of international relations. Maybe the question to leave you with is this: how do nations manage that fundamental tension, balancing their own critical domestic needs and politics with the undeniable necessity of global cooperation, especially when those two things seem to be pulling in completely opposite directions?